So hi everyone, and thank you AIOC for giving us the opportunity to present this update on endophthalmitis. And we have with us Dr. Nagendra Prasad, Dr. Abhijit, Dr. Anita, Dr. Indu, and Dr. Garima. So our first speaker will be Dr. Anita Ambasta, and she is in Regional Institute of Ophthalmology, Patna. Okay, Anita, you take over and start.
Yeah, we can see your
Can you see? Achha.
We can see your screen. Just make it full screen and please start.
Should I start? Can you hear me?
We can hear you very well, Anita. You start.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. I'll be talking on etiology and microbiology of postoperative endophthalmitis. As we know, endophthalmitis is inflammation of the inner courts of the eyeball and the intraocular cavities. Now, as the COVID cases are reducing, we're going to see a lot of backlog in our OTs, and this might be a good time to revise our microbiology of post-op endophthalmitis. Post-operative endophthalmitis is the most devastating complication of intraocular surgery, which is commonly associated with a variable visual outcome. Now, the predictors for visual outcome would be the visual acuity at the time of presentation and the causative agent. So if we want to manage these cases, it's important that we have a good guess as to what the causative agent is. This could be by the time of presentation, whether it's acute, delayed, or chronic endophthalmitis, and by what we see in the culture from the vitreous and the aquostats. But it's a hurrah moment if you can get a culture positive rate, as you can see, 66.4% in a Netherlands study, 61.8 in other studies. So the culture positive rates are very less. So where do these microbes come from into the intraocular structures? So many reports have suggested that it comes from the ocular surface, from the conjunctival cul-de-sac, from the ocular surface, and then from the adnexa. Now, one study said that they found 81.5% of the patients who had been put up for surgery in 200 eyes had a positive bacterial growth, out of which 49.4% was P. acnes, 24.7% was Coagulase negative staph, 4.3% was Staph aureus. A lot of MRSA was also found. So we are also in pediatric cases. So how does the bacterial flora in the conjunctival sac differ in adults and children? So in children, we have lesser number of species which are found, plus we have more streptococci which is seen in them, in the bacterial flora. Now, the most common cause of post-operative endophthalmitis is post-cataract surgery endophthalmitis. 90% of all the cases of post-op endophthalmitis that we see, simply because that's the most important, that's the most popular surgery that we're doing, the most common surgery rather. So what is the incidence of post-cataract surgery endophthalmitis? Now, in one study, it was 0.09%. In another study by Taban et al., it was 0.128% from 1963 to 2003, and thereafter it increased to 0.29% after the surgeon switched over to cell-sealing clear corneal incisions from sclerocorneal incisions, which had a lesser incidence. And then another study from University of Utah found that the rate of post-op endop from 1997 to 2003 was 0.19%, and this further dropped to 0.056% following the adoption of fourth-generation fluoroquinolones. So what does the endophthalmitis vitrectomy study say? Now, this forms the background of how we manage our cases of post-op endophthalmitis. Though this was done after in acute endophthalmitis post-cataract surgery, we have sort of extrapolated the results to cover almost all the surgeries that we're doing in ophthalmology. In this study, the culture results showed 69% with confirmed bacterial growth, 18% with no growth, and 13% with, can't read it. So most of the cases were gram-positive organisms. 70% of the isolates were gram-positive, coagulase negative staph, and gram-negative species were seen in 5.9% of cases only, and no fungi, probably because this was acute endophthalmitis. So what does the literature from India say, and how is it different from what the EVS told us? A survey from India reported that gram-positive bacteria accounted for only 53% of post-operative endophthalmitis cases, and 26% were gram-negative isolates, and 17% were fungal. Plus, evidence suggested that we had a rising trend of MRSA ocular infections overall, plus also as a percentage of all Staph aureus infections. Now, this is very pertinent because gram-negative gram-negative organisms are more virulent. They produce endotoxins, and they colonize the vitreous faster than rest. Now, this is another study where from India, where of the culture positive cases, 60% was nocardia. So India is a huge country, and we do get different microbes from different areas involved in post-op endophthalmitis, and it's important that we keep all this in mind. Now, this was another study which was published in IGO. Again here, this was in post-operative endophthalmitis cases, and here also the overall most common organism was the gram-negative bacilli, which was causing post-endophthalmitis, and amongst them it was Pseudomonas aeruginosa, which was the more common organism, plus overall also first time, as they said, it was Pseudomonas which was the overwhelmingly most common organism overall. Now, this is another study from the western part of the country, which sort of mimics the western data, where gram-positive organisms were predominant and gram-negative organisms were lesser in number, with E. coli being the predominant gram-negative organism. So what are the concerns regarding post-cataract surgery endophthalmitis? Now, in one study, Major et al. Had found from 1995 to 2008, that MRSA accounted for 44% of post-cataract surgery endophthalmitis, though in a similar time before, they had not found a single case. So from no case at around 1992 to 44% of post-cataract endophthalmitis in 1995 through 2008, that was a big jump. And another point of concern, that a significant proportion of Staph aureus cases were resistant not only to methicillin, but also to commonly used fourth generation fluoroquinolones, which we use a lot and on which we depend a lot. So that was what cataract surgery. What about instance of endophthalmitis, other intraocular surgeries? This is one study where they found 0.5% endophthalmitis post-cataract surgery and 0.3% post-PK and 0.018% following other intraocular surgeries. I'll be dealing with them one by one. Endophthalmitis post-pars plana vitrectomy. Now, this was one huge study done in Shankar Nethralaya, and where they analyzed more than 1 lakh post-pars plana vitrectomies which had been done, and they analyzed the endophthalmitis cases that they had got there, and they found that gram-negative cases were predominant as compared to gram-positive. Plus, they found that patients where tamponade had not been used had greater incidence of endophthalmitis than ones where they were used. Now, this is a chart which is showing probably the same thing in the as in that article, and apart from predominance of gram-negative infections, they also had a lot of mixed infections. Now, this is another study in post-pars plana vitrectomy, 20 gauge versus 25 gauge, and these and some data from the West suggested that 20G vitrectomy was associated with lesser number of post-op endophthalmitis because these were sutured and there was less chance of hypotony, which many in the MIBS studies were found, and this did not allow ingress of any extraocular fluid and organisms. But the previous study from Shankar Nethralaya found that their conclusion was that at best it could be said that MIVS did not lead to any more increase in cases of endophthalmitis. Endophthalmitis post-trabeculectomy. Although we are doing mostly cataracts, we also do trabeculectomies, though the incidences decrease as a result of new anti-glaucoma medication. And we all know that trabeculectomy, when combined with antimetabolites, leads to thin blebs, leaks, overhanging blebs, and more instances of infection and endophthalmitis. Now, what does the data say? The collaborative bleb-related infection incidence and treatment prospect.
Dr. Anita, I request you to please try and wind
Yeah,
up.
the collaborative, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
The collaborative bleb-related infection incidence and treatment study, a prospective study on bleb-related infection being conducted by Japan Glaucoma Society, determined that when antimetabolites was not used, the incidence of endophthalmitis post-trabeculectomy was 0.2 to 0.5%. And if adjunctive mitomycin C was used, it was 1.5 plus minus 0.6% at a 2.5-year follow-up. However, if the follow-up was increased to from 16 months to 8 years, if the follow-up was up till 8 years, it could be anything between 1.5 to 13.8%. And with the use of 5-FU also, there was some similar incidence of endophthalmitis, 1.9 to 13% when there was a follow-up till 12 years. So what is the microbiology of post-trabeculectomy endophthalmitis? Now, this study said that streptococci was the most common organism in acute endophthalmitis, and both streptococcus and Haemophilus influenzae in delayed endophthalmitis. In addition to H. influenzae, they also found gram-negative in few cases. Now, this is another study where the dominating etiology was staph and streptococci. Again, another study. What is happening? Again, another study where
Doctor, this
It's
is a
time's
buzzer.
up. You. It
Buzzer
is a
for
buzzer.
time.
Yeah. Okay.
the endophthalmitis post GDD, post the glaucoma drainage device, also the organisms found was similar to that which was found post cataract surgery. That is basically coagulase negative staph. Post intravitreal ventral anti-VEGF also, the majority was associated with coagulase negative staph, and 75% of post-injection cases had positive results. And this accounted for almost 8.5% of the total cases of endophthalmitis post-surgery. Now, in another study, post-anti-VEGF, streptococca was the most common organism seen in Western studies, probably as a result of this being outdoor procedure and masks being not used. Endophthalmitis post-PK also showed most common organism to be the gram-positive cocci, and they also had a lot of more than 10% of fungal cases where Candida was the predominant organism. So what does the text say? This is just a sum up of what I had said before, with post-keratoplasty being 0.382%, post-cataract surgery being 0.265%. And this is just a chart from CME iOS series on the microbe that we should think will be involved in cases of, depending upon the presentation, whether it's fulminant or acute or chronic. And just to conclude, post-op endophthalmitis is a life-threatening condition. It's important to identify the causative organism. Microbiological analysis of intraocular fluid and knowledge of geographic area helps in starting therapy. MRS endophthalmitis is rising. Atypical bacteria and polymicrobial infections are increasingly being isolated. Thank you.
Anita, is Amit ready, or we shall go to the next speaker?
We will have the keynote speaker at the end, so please go to the next speaker.
Okay. So next speaker is myself. Yeah.
Sundar's talk now only.
You can start.
Whatever we can take his talk at the end of the session also, no problem.
No, you finish him first.
Yeah.
Okay, you can introduce him and start.
Okay, so Dr. Sundar, please switch on your camera. So it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Sundar. Dr. Sundar Ramaswamy, a very close friend of mine. Actually, he's senior to us. His younger brother is a classmate of mine, a great surgeon, Dr. Sundar Ramaswamy from Penang, Malaysia. He did his MBBS from Manipal, from KMC Manipal. He did his MS ophthalmology from UKM, Malaysia. He's an FRCS, he's an FICO. He did his pediatric ophthalmology fellowship from SNEC and also from the University of Malaysia. He is right now a consultant at the Oasis Eye Center in Kuala Lumpur, and also is a visiting consultant to the Ministry of Health, Malaysia. He's got various awards by the Ministry of Health in Malaysia. So without wasting much of a time, Sundar is going to be live from there and he's going to present from there his talk. So over to you, Dr. Sundar.
Thank you, Dr. Amit, and I hope all of you can hear me clearly. A warm welcome from Kuala Lumpur. I'd like to thank the OIC and OIS for inviting me. I wouldn't waste any more time. I'll proceed with my talk. I hope you can see my screen. Yeah. Okay.
Not now, sir.
Yeah,
Can you
just
see?
let him
Can
share.
you see the screen now?
Not yet, sir.
Not yet.
Okay.
Not yet. Let me see. Let me end the show first. Let me see whether I can share the screen. Let me see. Okay, probably need some help on how to share this.
Sure, sir. I'll help you out.
Oh yeah, let me see. Share screen.
Yeah.
Can you?
All panelists? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Can you keep? Right. No.
There's a button at the bottom, share screen.
Share screen, yeah, and all panelists, right? Yeah. I hope
We're not able
you
to
can see.
see.
I'm going to go back again.
Does the backend team have a video otherwise of this? Can't see
Can you
Sundar.
see me now?
Can't see you.
Can't see me. I'm so sorry about this. Let me check it again.
Sir, can I help you out with
Green
this?
color.
Yes, please do. Please
Okay, so stop everything. My name is Sanjay. I'm the hall coordinator. Stop
do.
everything.
Sure.
Just do one thing. You have PPT or video?
A video here.
Okay, just open the video and stop the video for a moment. Open it and stop it.
Okay, let me see. Okay. Let me do this for you. Okay. Stop video, yes.
Yeah. Now click on the bottom, share screen.
Okay, share screen,
Now,
yes.
do you see multiple applications? Do you see a video there?
Share, optimize screen, share for video clip.
No, don't click on that. Just click on,
Uh-huh.
there is one more left option which says play
Yeah.
video sound.
Amit,
Share
can we move
yeah?
to the next speaker before
Yeah.
he gets ready?
Okay, sure.
That's better. Rajesh, move on to the next speaker.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, next speaker is myself, and warm welcome to all the panelists here. I'll be talking about the clinical features of endophthalmitis.
प्रशासन ने शहर के सभी अधिकारियों की धरपकड़ शुरू कर दी है। मैं आप सबसे निवेदन करता हूँ, विनती करता हूँ कि अगर आपको आपके आसपास
Okay, so the
Dr. Rajesh,
Some background sound is coming.
Let me mute everyone, then you can start.
yeah, please.
Dr. Rajesh, you please unmute and start now. Yes, Dr. Rajesh, you can start.
Yeah. So approximately 2/3 of all post-op cases are approximately 2/3 of all are post-op cases, and commonest it is commonest after cataract surgery because cataract is the most common operative procedure in eye. And of course, the intravitreal injections are becoming commoner than cataract surgery these days. So the incidence has been reported as 1 in 2,700. And the incidence overall varies from 0.03% to 0.1%. The incidence of endophthalmitis, though, has sharply declined over past 50 years. It is still one of the most catastrophic complications of eye surgery. And I'll be talking about symptoms and signs. So, of course, blurred vision is the most common complaint, and that is the most alarming complaint that patients actually care for, and they would call you back. And the sudden increase of pain usually occurs in 1 to 7 days after surgery, and it may be absent in 25% of cases because of the post-op medications. The lid edema, conjunctival chemosis, yellowish exudates in the cul-de-sac, corneal edema, infiltrates, cells, flare, hypopia, and all signs of inflammations are seen in such cases. Exudates and fibrin membranes are a very concerning signs whenever it is seen by the ophthalmologist. Cellular debris in the vitreous, if you could see through the media, and retinal phlebitis is one of the first and foremost signs that one sees in a case of endophthalmitis. And the moment you see that, you should suspect endophthalmitis. Only a red reflex or dark reflex may be visible, obscuring all other details. And usually, when we come across, the patients are referred to us are of this nature. And of course, poor dilatation and media opacity makes the posterior segment assessment very difficult. So the risk factors, we could divide it into surgical and others. What are the risk factors surgically would be wound abnormalities. You see this picture, there is a vitreous wick here, which leads to wound leak and sometimes can lead to inadvertent filtering bleb. And if there is a suture in place, it can lead to a suture abscess and endophthalmitis later on. And it has been seen that clear corneal incisions, there was a report that threefold increase of endophthalmitis, though the newer studies have not confirmed this increase in the incidence of endophthalmitis in temporal or clear corneal incisions. The other surgical risk factors are vitreous disturbance. Whenever you have a PC rent, in all those studies where PC rent or other disturbances were seen, the incidence of endophthalmitis was much more higher. And you see, these are the new techniques of scleral fixation lenses, where sometimes the haptic is absolutely exposed out to the outside world, inviting all the organisms into the eye. Sometimes the use of silk braided sutures can lead to infection. And contaminated solutions, IOLs, donor cornea, etc., are other causes of post-op endophthalmitis. The ocular risk factors are, you see, these are the very unhygienic, unhealthy lids. These can always lead to infection, inside eye. Severe MGD, blepharitis should be, taken care of before actually going in for surgery. Nasolacrimal duct infections and obstructions are always caution. And adnexal infections can also be, should be looked before any eye surgery. The systemic risk factors are active infection, diabetes, and immune compromise. This is a typical picture of a very severe bacterial endophthalmitis. This usually starts within 24 to 48 hours. And there is a marked visual loss, severe pain, lid edema, conjunctival hyperemia and chemosis, increasing AC reaction, hypopia, no red glow, rapid progression of signs are there. And fungal endophthalmitis, it is usually of delayed onset. Symptoms are mild to minimal discomfort, fibropurulent AC exudates, vitreous snowball exudates, vitreous abscess, and it is most commonly due to Candida or Aspergillus fusarium. Nocardia, as Anita said, there was a study, we were there when it was reported from Aravind Eye Hospital. Nocardia was found to be one of the commonest, maybe because of the barefoot habits in the South India. And the exogenous variant involves the anterior segment. Vitreous is usually not a very good medium for growth of nocardia. And P. acnes, we all talk about it. It's a late onset endophthalmitis. These are anaerobic gram-negative bacilli, normal commensal of the conjunctival sac, as Anita said, and equatorial white plaques are seen in the IOL. And it responds very well to steroids. But the moment you taper off the steroids, it again recurs. And exacerbation of inflammation after YAG capsulotomy. So people talk about sterile post-op endophthalmitis, or the other name is TAS. So the symptoms are usually less intense. You have these these could be because of intraocular drugs, gases, etc. The autoimmunity to lens cortical remnants can also lead to TAS. And residual chemicals from sterilization could be mechanical irritation of the iris ciliary body by IOL, excessive iris or vitreous manipulation. But I generally give a caution to everyone that the moment you see signs of inflammation in the eye in a post-op case, it is endophthalmitis until proved otherwise. Don't counsel yourself that, no, this cannot be infective and it is by some other means. No, it should be taken as endophthalmitis. And retained lens fragments and endophthalmitis may occur concurrently. Suspect infection in any post-op ocular inflammation with retained lens matter. So the lesson learned is early detection and timely intervention saves the eye, yet one can have unforeseen complications and one needs to be prepared for it. And visual recovery may be compromised following multiple procedures. A clear decision-making and documentation cannot be overemphasized. Thank you.
Rajesh, can we take
Yeah.
Dr. Sundar now?
Yeah, if he's ready, we can
Dr.
take him.
Sundar, are you ready? Dr. Sundar? Yeah, he's sharing his screen. He's ready. So
You're
thank
fine.
you, Rajesh. You finished 2 minutes before time your talk.
Yeah, because I have to compensate for others.
Excellent. Good team leader. Yeah, Dr. Sundar, we can see your screen.
Okay,
And
wonderful.
just go to slideshow. Yeah, go to slideshow. Thank you.
Yeah, so I'm on, right? Thank you very much. So I'm going to talk to you all about universal screening in newborns with wide field digital retinal imaging. So let me see. Okay. Right. Now, wide field digital retinal imaging, or WFDRI, as it's now known as, was actually started about 20 odd years back. And it was actually a chance collaboration between Dr. Lynn Murphy, she's an ocular oncologist, and Dr. Bert Massey. Dr. Bert Massey was actually an aerospace engineer. And by chance, they both met and they realized that there was a need for better ocular imaging in newborns and those with ocular pathology. And that's how they came up with the RedCam camera. And that was then found to be so useful that they expanded it to the use for ROPs, or retinopathy of prematurity. And that's how this camera came about. And eventually, we know that when this camera is used, it gives you a broader area of view of the retina. The normal fundus cameras, you can see, only gives you about 40 degrees in the center of the fundus, whereas the wide screens can go between 100 to about 130 degrees, depending on the type of camera you're using now. Right. So once they were doing a lot of work with ROP and retinoblastoma, they realized it could be expanded to other pathologies, and it was then expanded to anterior segment disorders. The way the camera was used was improved, and also for other ocular pathologies, like here we have FEVR, colobomas, and also the morning glory disc. So these are the extended uses they had, but most of it was in pathology, and they found it very useful for the prognosis and also the management and for parent education. So this was something very, very useful to pediatric ophthalmologists. But these devices, this is the machine we had, the RedCam 2 that we had in Hospital Kuala Lumpur in 2005. And this you can see is a very, very bulky machine. It's big and you can't really move it. It's very heavy. You need 2 to 3 people to push it around. But things have changed now, and the machines that you get, the camera systems that you get are a lot smaller. And you've got other manufacturers now in. We've got more portable units. You can see that the RedCam has become a lot smaller. We've got the RedCam Shuttle now. We've got the RedCam Portable. I have no financial interest in these devices. Yeah, just to make a note. India has come out with its own. We've got the Trinetra Neo now, which is also very small and portable. And of course, we have the Icon, which is by Phoenix. And these devices are light. They can be carried. They can actually be taken in a flight if you want to. Some of them they can just be pushed along by one person, a single operator. So it makes it so much easier to move it within the hospital, within wards. Yeah. What we do normally with newborns is very, very traditional. We get a newborn in the postnatal ward. The pediatric doctors or those associated with pediatrics will then just check the anterior segment, check the head neck surge, check the red reflex. If it's fine, they send the baby back. Now, if there's something very, very gross, then they of course pick it up and they send it to the ophthalmologist. But something, there's a lot of pathology that's actually missed. And in this time and day, missing an ocular pathology in a newborn can have, apart from it being detrimental to the baby in terms of health and vision long term, there are also a lot of medical legal implications, and we're already seeing that in Malaysia. Yeah. Interestingly, a study by Ming Sun et al. In China, when they did a study to compare testing the red reflex and actually using a wide field photography, they realized that the sensitivity of the red reflexes was just 4%. So, there's a lot it misses out. So this is just not enough. Wide field WFDRI is now picking up. It's now becoming more and more popular. It's gaining momentum. A lot of countries are slowly doing it, including India, but it's still at the infantile phase. Normally, if we were going to do it, it should be done within the first 3 days of birth. And the best place would be within the postnatal ward. Of course, if the baby has to go back, you can get them back and do it. Right. Now, we already have enough data to say that it definitely helps with better detection of potential ocular pathologies And this allows for an earlier intervention and definitely better outcomes. Yeah? Right. Now, interestingly, the screening doesn't have to be done by ophthalmologists or pediatric ophthalmologists. You just need to train, paramedics or technicians. And as long as they've got the feel of it, they know how to use it, they can do it. And they basically can also be trained to pick up any abnormality that is obvious, or over a period of time, they'll be adequately trained to pick up something which is abnormal within the retina. And they can actually report this to the ophthalmologist, either directly or through telemedicine. And it's easy, as I said, to move these instruments, these devices around. They can be placed in, any place of high demand, especially the postnatal wards, yeah? or even in the pediatric eye units. Now, so as I was mentioning, all these translates to better ophthalmological services, and it all definitely takes the burden off the ophthalmologist. You don't have to do it. You get somebody else to help you do it, and they report any abnormalities to you. Right. Now, how do we do it? It's, for a person who doesn't handle these devices, it's a bit scary. How do you put a 2 or 3 kilo baby in front of you, put a camera with a big handheld device on the eye and, rotate it and use it? No, it's not that difficult. It just takes practice, and it's actually quite safe. Now, all you need is about 6 to 8 mm of pupillary dilatation. If it's done in the postnatal ward, it's the best. The nurses there can handle these babies very well. They wrap them up, keep them warm, right? We just put a bit of topical anesthesia, use a mild baby speculum, and you just go on and slowly image it. We normally start imaging the anterior segment that's normally non-contact, right? And after we've done that, then we put in a coupling solution, a coupling fluid or any lubricant or gel, and we put the camera on top gently, and then we can start to image. And the imaging is normally done, when we do it, we take the posterior pole first, and then after that, we go on to imaging the superior, inferior, nasal, and temporal retinas. And we can actually produce a collage. Now I'm going to show you one. This is one of those that we can actually make. And this can be then sent to the pediatrician, pediatric ophthalmologist or the ophthalmologist reporting. So this is how we do it. And this is just an example. This shows ROP. Yeah? So this is how the pictures are taken. They're actually very wonderful and clear. Okay, next. Now, coming to studies, there are quite a number of studies which are now available, which are out over the last few years. And mostly they're from India and they're from China. And it's interesting that when they've done large numbers, they found that they find abnormalities in about 4 to 25% of these newborn babies. And it's the complete range. Yeah, you see almost all, they've caught almost all the abnormalities and they picked it up early, right? Ranging from hemorrhages all the way to retinal globomas. Right. Now, interestingly now, Anand Binekar, who's been doing a lot of work with widescreen imaging and telemedicine ROP. Now, he did a screening of about 1,000 over babies a couple of years ago, and he found that there were about 4.7% of these babies with abnormalities. A lot of them had actually fundus hemorrhages. But interestingly, when he extrapolated this study to the whole of India, he was saying that about 250,000 babies, 250,000 babies actually have eye problems that would need some form of intervention. That's a large number. And he actually went on to advocate that this should actually be a national policy in India, and also possibly something that should be extrapolated around the world. So, so it is something that I think should eventually be addressed. Right. Now, interestingly, there was another study from Spain that, we were wondering, how safe is this? Would we want to abrade the cornea, injure the eye? Now, they actually did a study where they compared the BIO with indentation and also the the wide field imaging. And they found that the wide field imaging was actually less stressful to the baby than actually indirect ophthalmoscopy with instead indentation. So actually, it's less painful and less stressful to the baby. So it's actually quite safe. Right. Now, long-term benefits. Now, another study from India by Goyal and his group, when they did a screening of about 1,000 plus babies, they found that in terms of screening, when it's done by a paramedic or an optometrist, it showed actually monetary gain in the long term, in the sense that they saved a lot of money in terms of potential financial loss from missing children who may actually go blind, right? And also saving on skilled manpower. See, this doesn't have to be done by an ophthalmologist. They actually put numbers to this, right? So it's interesting. So there are long-term benefits. Yeah. The next thing I want to talk about is the major finding. Now, Lee's group in China, they did the largest number. They did about 3,500 newborn babies. They did the wide field screening on them, and they found that in their cohort of babies, about 25% almost had retinal hemorrhages, and
Dr.
a significant number. Yes.
I'm sorry to interrupt. Your time of 10 minutes is over. Due to paucity of time, we would request you to conclude, please.
Yes. Okay. I'll give you one more minute. Right. So I'm going. As I was saying, this is a major problem, which was retinal hemorrhages. So in Malaysia, we did our own study, and we had similar results, and we found that spontaneous vaginal deliveries was one reason for these vitreous hemorrhages and retinal hemorrhages. And though these hemorrhages can resolve within a period of 6 weeks, we feel that in quite a number of them, when it involves the macula, it can actually cause problems in the sense it can change the retinal architecture, it can cause axial elongation of the eye, cause stimulation deprivation, amblyopia, and eventually it could lead to vision loss. So I think we should actually take this universal screening more seriously, and it would definitely be useful. Definitely the wide field digital retinal imaging would be something that we can consider. It's safe. It's also something that is economical, and it also saves on skilled manpower in the long term. The only problem is in the short term cost. It's very expensive. These devices cost anywhere between 50,000 to 150,000 USD. So I think that would be the main impediment in the short term. But in the long term, it definitely will benefit. Yeah. So I'll end that here. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Dr. Sundar.
You're most welcome. Thank you.
Yeah. So Dr. Rajesh, over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Sundar. It was a nice presentation, and it is interesting that all the babies should be screened at birth. It's interesting. I don't know. That will be a lot of burden for a country like India. Anyways, our next speaker is Dr. Indu, who will be talking about relevant investigations in a case of endophthalmitis. And Dr. Indu will have to finish in time. Dr. Indu is a practitioner at Jabalpur and a very prolific surgeon, and all the who's who in Jabalpur gets operated by her. Dr. Indu, please.
Okay, a very good afternoon to all. I would like to thank AIOS and Dr. Rajesh for giving me an opportunity to speak. So I will be speaking on the relevant investigations in a case of post-operative endophthalmitis. Now, what should the worksheet of a case of endophthalmitis look like? History taking is of paramount importance. The inciting event, the onset, whether fulminant, acute, or chronic, the progression, any associated illness like uncontrolled diabetes, chronic debilitating diseases, immunocompromised status, all should be noted. So workup of a patient of endophthalmitis should be considered as an emergency because the pathogens and the toxins can rapidly damage the ocular structures. Most importantly, informed consent for all further management needs to be done. So once you have made the clinical diagnosis, it needs to be confirmed by identification of the organism, and the best samples to take are those from the aqueous and vitreous. However, in only 36 to 40% cases from aqueous and 56 to 70% from the vitreous, you get a positive result. There have been reported cases wherein the aqueous aspirates were positive, whereas those from the vitreous were negative. Hence, you need to take samples from both the sides. Now, 0.1 to 0.2 ml of aqueous, hypopyon, or the exudate is withdrawn using a 24 gauge needle. Now, vitreous is the most important source to know the causative organism. Vitreous aspirations can be done using 23 gauge needle introduced through the pars plana just before injecting intravitreal antibiotics. However, many a times you'll end up in a dry tap because in these cases, the vitreous tends to be denser and it contains membrane. Furthermore, it is fraught with the danger of producing vitreous tractions. Hence, the safest method is by vitreous biopsy. which can be done either with the infusion line on, which will give you a diluted sample, or without the infusion line, wherein the suction port of the vitrector is connected with is replaced with a shorter tubing to which is connected a syringe to facilitate manual suction, and 0.2 to 0.3 ml of vitreous is taken. The other samples that you could look for are the explanted IULs, the IOFBs, sutures, abscissed iris tissue, and collection from the vitrectomy cassettes. So once you have the samples in hand, then and there in OR, you are required to make 2 slides, one for Gram and one for Giemsa stain. Now, care needs to be taken while preparing the slide that you should not make it too thin, because then it will lead to dispersion of the organism. But if you make it too thick, it will take up heavy stain, making the identification of the pathogen difficult. Then if you're suspecting it to be a case of fungus, a KOH mount is to be done, and the slides prepared are stained with Gamori methenamine silver. Then 1 drop each should be inoculated into the brain heart infusion broth and the thiocalculate broth. These 2 are enrichment medias. And once you have done this, this is then transported to the microbiology lab, where it is kept in incubator for say 16 to 18 hours. This is the time we give to make the environment favorable for the multiplication of the pathogen. So after the standing time, the samples from these broths are taken, and then they are subsequently plated on blood, chocolate, McConkey agar, Severod's agar, and the Brucella blood agar. Now, what could be the reasons for negative culture? The presence of fastidious organism, by which I mean to say those organisms that have complex nutritional requirement, or that they will grow only when a particular nutrient is added to the diet. Then insufficient sampling, cases of sterile endophthalmitis, and whenever patient has received prior antibiotics. Now, many a times you would require a repeat culture when the clinical response that you are expecting is not the same. Then the presence of contaminants in the media, and in cases of fungi, because the fungi tends to show up late. A word about the new microbiological detection methods, the FISH technique, the microarrays, the LAMP technique, they're still in the process of development and not routinely used. Now, in DNA sequencing, the arrangement of nucleotides in the DNA is studied, and it is then matched with a database that is already stored in the computer. This is a very useful test for the identification of fastidious and uncultivable microbes, but because it is very expensive, it is not routinely used, but it is of great importance in all research and academic purpose. Now, Malditov-MS test, like you all must be knowing, a series of outbreak of endophthalmitis in PGI Chandigarh following intravitreal antibiotics. With the help of Malditov-MS test, within a period of say 4 to 5 hours, they could identify the pathogen, the culprit, to be some Pseudomonite type of organism. But the disadvantage is that the initial cost of the Malditov equipment is too high. Now, a word about the molecular methods, the real-time PCR and the multiplex PCR. It is a highly sensitive and specific test. It gives quick result. It has got high transport toleration, and it is very valuable in cases of fastidious organism. Now, how does it work? So as we all know, every organism contains some unique species-specific DNA, and what it does is that it makes them visible. So main steps involved in PCR, first is the denaturation of the DNA, wherein the double helix of the DNA is broken down. And then the complement chain, the primers are introduced. Once the coupling between the primer and the DNA template occurs, then extension of the chain by DNA polymerase enzyme takes place. Now, PCR technique have led a way into a new era by allowing rapid detection of microorganisms that were previously difficult or impossible to detect by traditional microbiological methods. Now, however, there are few limitations of PCR. The problem of false positivity, which could be because of the contamination, then absence of clinical correlation. Many a times DNA from the dead organism present in the sample can be detected as false positive. Then it does not come into the antibiotic sensitivity. Then PCR testing might not be available at all places, and highly precise thermal cycler is needed. So while sending the sample for PCR, you have to mention the organism for which you want PCR based on your clinical diagnosis. For presence of any other pathogen in the sample, it would not come in because it is not tested. So as we all know that this is an organism specific test, and for every organism, there is a specific primer. So you need to add primer specific to the pathogen again and again, and this greatly increases the cost of the test. However, nowadays multiplex PCR are available wherein 2-3 primers can be introduced at the same time. So a word about the imaging modality. The ultrasound of the BRIE scan gives valuable information regarding the vitreous membrane and opacities, the anatomical status of the retina, the extent of inflammation, choroid detachment, etc. And USGs must, before any form of interventional diagnostic or therapeutic intervention, wherein you don't see the fundal details. Few systemic investigations like complete hemogram, blood sugar, blood and urine cultures need to be done. Now, a word about the cluster infection. You need to discuss in detail about the cases, check all the documents, determine breach in protocol, and determine area requiring improvement. As we all know, sepsis can occur either from the surgeon side, the patient, instrument, or the environment side. All these needs to be taken into account. All cases are to be reviewed, identify the surgeon-related factors. So once you have an outbreak of cluster endophthalmitis, the first thing that you need to do is to put a halt to all further surgeries. Now, microbiological sampling should be done from irrigating solution, intra and extracameral salts and drugs, viscoelastics, phaco machine, air filter, environmental swabbing, microscopes, especially the undersurface of the objective of the microscope, all the solutions that are using in the OT. Now, to summarize, lid margin and conjunctival swab cultures are no longer recommended. Samples from both the aqueous and vitreous are to be obtained, and they should first be inoculated into the enrichment media to increase the yield, and then subsequently plated on aerobic, anaerobic, and fungal plates. And no culture should be considered negative until you have observed it for a period of 2 weeks. Now, culture from the suture removed in presence of suture abscess is mandatory. Now, PCR and molecular diagnostic methods, they help in the rapid identification of the organism in chronic and atypical cases. Ultrasound is an adjuvant, but not a primary modality in the diagnosis of endophthalmitis. And newer technique may play a larger role in the diagnosis of endophthalmitis in future. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Indu. Wonderful, wonderful, and very much in time. That's even more wonderful. We have now we know the organisms causing it, the clinical features, how they look like, and how to investigate. Now, Dr. Abhijit will be talking about the treatment part of it. How to manage a case of endophthalmitis. Dr. Abhijit, please.
Yeah, everybody can see it?
No, doctor, we cannot see your screen.
Okay.
Not yet.
Now it's coming. We can see your desktop.
Yeah.
Yeah, please make it
Now
full
okay?
screen. Yeah, now okay. Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Good to go.
So this is the endophthalmitis management. Everything has been said about the diagnosis and the investigation. So we will not waste much time about that thing and go straight into the management. So only one, this is important. Why it is important? Because it's a loss of vision, loss of reputation, and also medical legal problems. And acute, when to suspect and what to do. So as Dr. Rajesh already went through the symptoms, I'm not again going through these slides and incidents and what you look for. Then it is also the earliest retinal findings, also elaborated. Then ultrasound D scan 48 hours before and after vitrectomy. And progressive vitritis is the hallmark of any type of endophthalmitis. So now we come to intervention. So intravitreal antibiotics covering gram-negative and gram-positive urgently, and TAP for stain and culture and PCR as explained by Dr. Indu. And topical antibiotics 1 hourly we give along with mydriatics and topical steroids if cornea is not involved. Also intravitreal antifungal we give if KO smear is positive. So intervention is correction of wound leaks, suture abscess, vitreous incarceration, eroding scleral sutures in SA5L and other surgical problems. Then also along with it, systemic antibiotics, which is questionable, but we use 4th generation protocolum. So at presentation to the post intravitreal steroids, the role of steroids in intravitreal antibiotic along with intravitreal or systemic. There is some topics of discussion. But after intravitreal antibiotics, steroids definitely have a role to decrease the inflammation and to save the eye. And also systemic recommended, not in fungal initially, but in cases of fungal end and in case of diabetics, we don't give systemic steroids. And topical also we don't give if cornea is involved. And intravitreal steroids in case of fungal end also, there are some conflicting reports. So what are the improvement signs? Those are the pain decreases, cornea infiltrate stabilizes, AC exudates are less, sounds shows better results. So follow up every 12 hours to 24 hours we do. And in case of fulminant cases, particularly pseudomonas, you can see in fact earlier. And then as the eye improves, you go to 24 to 48 hours follow up. And if it is after 24 hours, if it is stabilized, then you wait. Or if it deteriorates, then you go to the next step. So either you try repeat intravitreal or you can go for the vitrectomy. So what are the indications for vitrectomy? Nowadays, lots of people we do early vitrectomy, but ideal situation where the endophthalmitis vitrectomy study says the vision less than hand movement. In cases of cornea involving endophthalmitis not responding to intravitreal antibiotic, late post-trabeculectomy surgery, fungal and P. acne cases, and also in diabetics, early pars plana vitrectomy may help. So principles of surgery is IOL not removed in most cases nowadays. And anterior chamber maintenance initially we start, then anterior membrane and posterior capsule to be cut, of course, to remove safely as much vitreous as possible, avoid basic systems, strictly vacuuming the exudates over posterior pole. And usually to avoid basic suction, so now we can show you whatever we are telling about this.
Started the surgery with anterior chamber maintenance. Next, we cleaned the anterior chamber and removed the membrane over intraocular lens. The surgery proceeded by clearing the anterior vitreous and cutting central posterior capsule. Careful removal of vitreous and membrane continued till the posterior pole was visible. Previously, we used to stop here, but here we forced ahead with careful vacuum cleaning the exudates over. We also clean the peripheral vitreous. Indirect ophthalmoscopy is done. That along with dexamethasone injected. Microincisional 25 gauge and 23 gauge system helped us produce less trauma to already inflamed eye.
And this is the case where you can see the cornea condition, and it is totally infiltrated and planned for vitrectomy immediately with keratoconus. It's a redness, pain, loss of vision since 4 days. Presenting visual acuity was PL only with inaccurate ER.
Situation both for the patient and the clinician. The cornea is totally involved and there is absolutely no posterior segment view. Moderate to severe reaction. So keratoprosthesis is the answer of all the queries here. We started with removal of the corneal button. Okay. We should try to take as big a button as possible so that most of the infected areas will come out. The anterior chamber also cleaned and the membranes removed. What happened with the intraocular lens? In case of severe infections, better to remove the intraocular lens and make it a single chamber. Keratoconus was fixed to the sclera with 4-0 seal. Sclerotomy ports were made And 25-gauge sclerotomy ports gave us definite advantages, as we can see here. In this type of cases, what should be the limit of vitrectomy? One can very well ask the question. We should try to remove as much as possible vitreous. Triamcinolone acetonide was very helpful in inducing posterior vitreous detachment and identifying the membranes so that we could remove them as far as possible. One important point to be noted during closure is to make these sclerotomy ports totally secure. And keratoprosthesis and the cornea, the host cornea is slowly fastened, as you can see here. Donor cornea was already processed, and vancomycin and ceftazidime were injected. Balanceone solution was used intraocularly to make the eyeball firm. The result wise, we can see the posterior segment got cleared pretty well. Anterior segment showed the cornea clearing and the decreasing inflammation. Keratoprosthesis situation both.
So these are the doses of the injections which we usually use. The vancomycin and ceftazidime are the standard we use till the culture report comes. And then amikacin rarely used nowadays. We use the amphotericin and the voriconazole also in case of the fungus. Then also we use moxifloxacin and cefuroxime also, and of course injection dexamethasone. Those are the doses you can see. Thank you for your patience here.
Thank you very much, Dr. Abhijit. Very nice videos, but that shows that never give up, keep trying. At least the patient will have some vision at the end of the day. And our next, you have managed it so well, but still there are complications and there are issues post endophthalmitis treatment. Dr. Garima, a very upcoming retina specialist from Nagpur, she'll be talking about complications and their management in a case of endophthalmitis. Garima, over to you. Unmute yourself, Garima. Garima, you are not heard, not audible.
Yes, is it?
Yeah, now it's okay.
Is my video? Am I seen?
Yes, ma'am.
These are visible.
My screen is visible?
Yes.
Okay.
Kindly make it full screen, ma'am.
Okay.
Perfect to go.
Yes. A very good afternoon to everyone. Thanks to the scientific committee and our chief instructor for having me here. This topic is of importance so as to know and manage the acute disease, keeping in mind the possibility of issues which might come up later. Post-operative endophthalmitis is a sensitive matter itself and needs counseling, documentation, and follow-up. In eyes with endophthalmitis, there's increased risk of additional complicating conditions from associated sequelae of panuveitic response. We have divided this topic into anterior and posterior segment complications. In anterior segment, corneal opacification can be seen, which is more common if the hypopyon is extensive and chronic. Posterior synechiae, secondary glaucoma, band-shaped keratopathy, ocular hypotony and phthisis may be noted. In initial phase, if the fibrin causes adhesion formation, it may lead to posterior synechiae and peripheral anterior synechiae with iris bombay and secondary angle closure glaucoma. Iris atrophy, atonic pupil, and even unmasking of radial iris vessels may be noted. Significant and protracted reduction of IOP after treatment of endophthalmitis is an ominous sign, and we should look for choroidal or retinal detachment, ciliary body detachment from choroidal effusion or cyclitic membranes, and even destruction of ciliary body function may be there. Long-term hypotony devolves into phthisis. So, a timely VR intervention may salvage the vision and glow from ocular hypotony. Drainage of large CDs and small effusions may restore proper ciliary body opposition from normal reduction with normal reduction of IOP. Repair of RD and plus minus silicon oil, excision of anterior vitreoretinal membranes and membranes can serve to elevate IOP to functional range. Despite all the efforts, we might unfortunately see these conditions also, atrophic bulbi or phthisis. The physician should begin cycloplegia with the first line medication itself. Topical steroids can be instituted as soon as it is deemed safe. With this approach, the physician may mitigate the toxic effect of the infection and limit the acute and the long-term sequelae of endophthalmitis. Coming to the posterior segment complications, it includes vitreous floaters, macular pathologies, retinal detachment, drug-induced macular toxicity. Vitreous floaters are documented to be around less than 1% in incidence. They are vitreous opacities made up of inflammatory cells, transudates, and necrotic tissue. Aggressive management with topical, with or without oral steroids to eliminate any residual inflammatory response often leads to gradual resolution of vitreous opacities. Vitrectomy is effective in removing non-clearing debris or to effect very rapid visual rehabilitation. Some sort of macular abnormalities is observed in around 55 to 63% of cases. Non-tractional edemas in 7 to 13%, ERM in 39%, vitromacular tractions in 6%, and macular thinning in 10%. CME is a common cause of vision loss. Inflammatory cascade involves the production of multiple cytokines and growth factors, which increases the vascular permeability. Usually, most of the CMEs resolve between 6 to 12 weeks of time, but if the CME persists for more than 6 months, it is called chronic CME, which can cause disruption in neural network, can lead to gliosis and atrophy, resulting in permanent visual loss. Though the mechanism of CME development is inflammatory, but in cases of post-operative endophthalmitis, it can have a mechanical component also, because these cases have broken posterior capsule with vitreous traction or vitreous incarceration in wound or IOL malpositioning. So the causes of development and persistence of CME are posterior synechia, IOL capture, choroidal thickening with hypotony, epiretinal membrane formation, vitreous debris with associated inflammatory stimuli. Steroids are the mainstay of treatment. Despite medical management, if CME doesn't resolve, we can consider vitrectomy, and we should try peel premacular membranes, ILM peeling. We should look to remove all the vitromacular traction while doing vitrectomy, remove vitreous adhesions to iris, capsule, IOL, and look for the cyclitic membranes if any. Epiretinal membrane is commonly associated with inflammatory conditions, which can lead to visual changes and metamorphopsia. If any ERM is there, we should try to remove the ERM. Along with ERM removal, ILM peeling is also considered so as to limit the reproliferation of ERM in eyes undergoing surgeries. After removal of this thick ERM, ILM peeling is being considered, so to avoid the reproliferation. Macular pucker, the incidence is found to be around less than 2%. It causes distortion of foveal architecture, contributes to decreased vision, metamorphopsia, or diplopia. Vitrectomy can be considered in such a case. Retinal detachment is a feared complication with the risk of 7.4 to 8.3%. Complicated cataract surgery with broken capsule, longer operative time, retained lens material have a greater risk of resultant intraocular infection. Not surprisingly, these events also increase the risk of retinal detachment. Poor surgical outcomes is noted in patients with multiple tears, necrotic retina with atrophic retinal breaks, proliferative vitreoretinopathy, and optic neuropathy. Frequency of RRD is higher in patients requiring additional procedures, more virulent organisms, poor presenting visual acuity. It was found that if the patient of endophthalmitis has RRD, around 27 to 38% of cases have vision of more than 20/40, as compared to patients of endophthalmitis who did not develop RRD. In those cases, the visual acuity of 20/40 or more was found in 55% of cases. Though anatomical success rate of detachment surgery is around 78%, but visual prognosis is poor. Surgery for RRD post-endophthalmitis is challenging because of poor dilation of pupil, corneal haze, proliferative vitreoretinopathy, which is a major risk. Again, anatomical success rate is considered to be 78% in EVS study, but occurrence of detachment was correlated with poor visual outcome. Retinal toxicity in the form of macular infarct, which is whitening of macular area with intraretinal hemorrhage at posterior pole. Toxicity is associated with aminoglycosides, most notably with gentamicin, less common with amica and tobra. Amphotericin B also causes retinal toxicity. Hemorrhagic occlusive retinal vasculitis is a rare but devastating complication of endophthalmitis management and prophylaxis. HORV has been associated with routine intracameral use of vancomycin also. So, prevention of endophthalmitis is much cheaper than its management. Although some of the problems may resolve on their own, few may lead to fixed, progressive, severe visual loss and ocular morbidity. Patients who experience delayed VR pathologies after endophthalmitis may remain at high risk for poor visual outcome. Visual prognosis may be determined to some extent by preoperative vision loss, infection severity, and preoperative pathologies, like if we are treating vitreous opacity as compared to RD or not. Visual results are highly variable. We all fight like a Bahubali, but it should be done in the setting of appropriate expectation and patient selection. Thank you.
Thank you, Garima. Excellent, excellent presentation and very much in time too. And now, last but not the least, the most important part in a case of endophthalmitis that it shall not happen. And what are the protocols for the pre-op and the OR, and how do we document so that the litigations are taken care of? Over to Dr. Nagendra Prasad. He is the stalwart from Patna, and just listen to him for all this. Nagendra, sir, please.
Thank you, Dr. Rajesh Sahai, for giving me this opportunity, and Chairman Scientific Committee. I am having problem inside the screen sharing. Is it my screen is visible?
No, doctor, it's not yet visible.
Okay. I just clicked the share screen.
Okay, now what do you see? Do you see your PPT open there?
My PPT is not there here.
Okay, do one thing. Don't do anything. It is by default selecting your desktop screen. Just click on the right hand side bottom blue color, say share screen.
Okay.
Now we can see your complete screen. Now open your PPT.
Now open. Okay.
Yeah.
Now it is coming.
Just zoom it. Full screen.
Sure. Yeah.
And you're good to go.
Thank you. My topic is pre-op care, OT protocol and documentation part. This is a very huge topic, but I would like to cover in a stipulated time. As you know that endophthalmitis is a devastating condition, but tackling it is a big challenge because there are many factors involved. There is no standard protocol till now, and there is a individual variation and custom by the different surgeon. So it is very difficult to pinpoint a certain point condition, but there are measures to prevent it. How we do it? By reducing the organism on the ocular surface prior to the surgery, by reducing exposure to the organism during the surgical procedure, or eradicating the bacteria that enters the eye after the cataract surgery. How do we do that? By identification of the high-risk patient, like old debilitated patient, immunocompromised patient, complicated cataract cases may harbor some immunocompromised condition. Meticulous lid hygiene is important, and you have to pay definitely heed over the lid hygiene. That is often a missed part. Control of systemic disease like hypertension and diabetes should be there, like blood pressure should not be more than 165 to 95, and as per the AIOS guidelines of endophthalmitis prevention, Fasting blood sugar should not be more than 150 milligram, or random or postmortem should not be 200 milligram. And preoperative topical antibiotic is not mandatory, but everybody use it. And if you want to use it, just use a broad spectrum antibiotics. But providine iodine is must for the prevention for painting and all, and the contact time should not be less than 3 minutes. And there should not be any contact procedure on the day of the surgery, like biometry or tonometry. If you are going to do that, then you postpone surgery better for the another day. And medical fitness from qualified physician is the must, as it may help you if something happens wrong to a patient goes to the court and all. We are paying very little attention to the hygiene of the patient. On the day of the surgery, you have to ask the patient to pull bath, washing their head and face with soap and water thoroughly. Patient to wear clean washes cloth, OT dress with cap and gown. Patient should not wear its own clothes. Food should be covered with disposable bag. And as I previously said, apply providine iodine 5% on the skin or 10% on the skin. And in the cul-de-sac, you can use 5% betadine, providine iodine, and leave dried for 3 minutes before shifting to OT table, and to be painted again on the table. Disposable adhesive drapes is must to isolate the lid, and tucking the latches within the drapes is very important, because the lid lashes is a very resource of contamination. And there is no need to cut the eyelashes. And when you use the speculum, it should be screw type that pulls the lid separate wide open, and it reduces the by chance lashes coming to the operating field. While speculum gives poor exposure, so it should not be used except the inpatient or pediatric cases. So far as OT protocol is concerned, for the general, written informed consent is mandatory. It should be in a patient language, explaining the risk involved and benefit expected, and it to be signed by the patient, his or relative, or by the interpreter if the patient is not understanding your language. Consent paper should be handed over to the patient 1 to 2 days before the surgery, so as to read it fully, read it and understand fully. And it should be clearly mentioned that the risk and benefit of the surgery and expected visual outcome, and of normal saturation, you can continue the surgery. And also monitoring the patient, the general condition with this machine. If you are having a high risk case like 3 or more comorbidity, anesthetologist or physician should be there into the OT, and in the OT, and IV lines should be maintained before the starting of the surgery. Usually I don't maintain the IV line routinely. There should be a crash cart in the OT containing all the mandatory emergency drugs, and there should be provision to transfer the patient to the hospital if there any case emergency occurs, if you are not dealing with the emergency in your hospital. For the doctors and staff, everybody is well versed with this. Anybody entering the OT must change their cloth in the changing room. Clothes should be clean and dry. Anyone with any of which should not be allowed to enter in the OT. There should be a separate sleeper for OT and the bathroom. No stitch cloth inside anyone, including doctor and staff. Hand scrubbing is done with betadine, soap solution, chlorhexidine scrub for at least 3 minutes. If you are using liquid soap, then it should be washed with 5 minutes, and there is no bar soap allowed. And for scrubbing, purified water should be used like RO or UV sterilized. OT staff, once started surgery, should not get close towards the OT table or towards head of the patient to minimize the air exchange. And the sterilized fresh new pair of gloves for every case should be used, and use sterilium between the cases. In continuation with the doctor staff, nothing much to tell about it. Preferably use a sterilized disposable gown with water resistant property should be used, because if you use sterilized linen, it may get soiled and may contaminate. Mask and OT cap should be worn properly, and scrubbed hand should be positioned in front of above the waist, in front of the chest, and surgeon, including all the staff, should not come out of the OT with the dress on. If came out, must change and re-scrub. Handling the microscope is important, and it should be handled with the covers supplied with the microscope by the company people. Intraocular fluid is an important consideration because it is the fluid which goes into the eye, and it should be 1-for-1 rule, 1 bottle of fluid for 1 patient, and preferably pouch or plastic bottle should be used. And in case of glass bottle, always do vacuum test. Look for bubble upon putting the drip set. If it is not there, means there is some leak into the bottle. Before use, inspect the bottle against a light physically to look for clarity and any growth. BSS or ringer lactate are equally effective in doing the surgery. There is no need to re-sterilize and seal volatile. Wound integrity is very important on the table as highlighted by the previous speakers. Always ensure the wound is non-leaky. When in doubt, suture to be applied. Keep the IOP on a high side at the end of the surgery to prevent sucking back of the conjunctival fluid into the eye. And by making the tighter intraocular pressure, high intraocular pressure, you can cross-check your sealing of the wound. Anything which goes inside the eye should be changed in each case. Intracameral antibiotic is preferable. No subconjunctival antibiotic, no betadine drops at the end of surgery. I have seen many surgeons putting at the end of the surgery and try to finish surgery within 15 minutes before. Beyond that, local disinfecting, the effect is many. So far as OT layout concerned, it should be divided into 4 zones: outer zone, mid zone, aseptic zone, and disposable zone. Outer zone should be protective zone, reception. Mid zone, clean zone, common area, changing room, transfer zone. Aseptic zone comes all scrubbing, gowning, gloving, autoclave, and disposable for disposing all the things. Isolation of the OT is important, and it is the if you are using new OT, 3 OT washing followed by fumigation and 3 conjugative negative cultures to there. Fumigation is not required if there is a positive pressure ventilation in the OT. Running OT single, if you are running daily OT, then single fumigation, infective mopping, and mopping weekly is enough. Use of fogger machine is preferable. Formalin or newer ingredients can be used like Bacillon and all. Monitoring of sterilization is important by pushing 3 indicators: the one outside the wrap, second inside the wrap, and third on inside the tray. Logbook to be maintained. Now, important consideration: AC should be cleaned every day, in monthly, and there is no scope for window AC. Servicing, cleaning every month, documented. It should be documented. Floor surface, microscope, sink, drain must be cleaned daily. OT size is important, 160 square feet per person, but it is, but according to NABH, 400 square feet as NABH. In practical, you can reduce the proportionate to the number of the people according to your OT. Isolation by autoclave and all. Documentation part should be in the way that it justifies the cataract surgery or any other surgery, taking into consideration of chief complaint patient. Chief complaint confess symptoms like blood vision, visual distortion, reduced contrast sensitivity, complaint of glare associated with functional impairment. Visual acuity is required because patient only comes for the vision. And cataract documents should provide existence of cataract on the paper. And other reason, if you are removing the cataract, then it should be mentioned there, like lens-induced glaucoma, retinal diseases. And you always put a prognosis, how patient is going to improve after the surgery. Informed consent is must. Investigation pertaining to need to the physician and clearance should be there, and it should be duly stamped signature by the witness. This ends my presentation. Thanks for your patient hearing. Long live AIOS. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Nagendra sir. I think we have very little time, only 5 minutes for any discussion whatsoever. So, Dr. Abhijit, what is there to add in? Sir, please. Nagendra
I have
sir.
one question, Dr. Abhijit. The surgery which he did, the keratoprosthesis. After that, what is the course of the disease after the patient eye? Like you put the any corneal button or over there, or just
it was there. It showed it.
Yeah, he did.
Yeah. We have to put a corneal button after removing the keratoprosthesis. Then we put the intravitreal antibiotics also, and then we closed.
At the same sitting only.
Yeah, same sitting.
Same sitting. I was unknown.
Probably keratoprosthesis was used only for the surgical. Till this,
Temporary
till he finished the surgery. Yes.
You have to have a corneal surgeon side by side.
Yeah,
or you
yeah,
do
yeah.
it?
We had our cornea surgeons.
It is
also.
very- okay.
Dr.
Thank you.
Abhijit, how often you use some other antibiotics in bacterial endophthalmitis other than vancomycin and amikacin/ceftazidime?
Lots of times in case of such of cornea involving cases, we have to use more gram-negative antibacterials. Well, then also seeing the medical aspects, we usually use for the culture, but when it is too extensive or we are suspecting some pseudomonas or something, then we go for the other like imipenems and meropenems and then piperacillin tazobactam.
Okay, you have been using all these in your
Yeah,
practice.
we have to use, and they give good result.
Nagendra sir, in your talk, you said that it is not mandatory to use intracameral antibiotics like many anti-segment surgeons do. But what is most important is that, yeah. Please,
I
sir.
did not talk about. I told that preoperative antibiotic is not necessary. Intracameral
Okay.
antibiotic is necessary because there is a good evidence of prophylaxis of putting intracameral antibiotic by Arvind Rai, very 10 lakhs cases or something like
Okay, so instead of preoperative antibiotics, it is better to use povidone iodine, as you
iodine. It is a customary. Some people use it, some people does not.
No, that has to be done because there has been studies in intravitreal injections. People have shown that those who declined these povidone iodine had 100% incidence of endophthalmitis.
Yeah.
So to sterile the cul-de-sac, it is better to use that. I mean, I have reservations about intracameral antibiotics. I don't know how often Garima advocates intracameral antibiotics, moxifloxacin, etc. Do you do that, Garima?
Yes, we use it. Yeah, we use it routinely.
We have anti-segment surgeons, Nagendra sir, Anita, and
Yeah.
Indu madam. You all prefer to use intracameral
Yeah, I use
antibiotics.
I definitely
How about
use
you,
it
Anita
because-
and Indu madam?
No, I don't use intracamerals. But we do use
There
the
is a yeah, Dr. Anita, just finish here.
I have few reservations. I don't use it on a routine basis. Only in the high risk cases, then I usually go for it.
Means, how do you define your high-risk cases?
Diabetics, some
Okay.
periocular pathology, long-standing periocular pathology, then of course I go for it.
Okay. And what are your
Routinely,
reservations,
I-
Anita? Moving fast because we have less time left, only 13 seconds or so. Anita, what are your reservations?
No reservations at all, except that I've been thinking to incorporate it in my practice.
Okay.
I
So
think it's
if
a
you-
good idea, in fact.
Okay, if you come across a case of endophthalmitis, first or second day, what do you do generally? This is for the benefit of general ophthalmologist per se.
Definitely,
Call-
we go for-
call a
we-
friend.
We follow the EBS protocol. We call the retina person, the retina friend. Yeah. No, so basically, what the EBS has to say, we follow that protocol. You
Yeah.
give the intravitreal, and then wait for the response, then give the second, and then call the friend.
Okay, do you do intravitreal yourself, or you ask that to do
No,
your
we
retina specialist?
Anybody who's in the OT that day will give it for
Okay.
you.
Same with you, Nagendra sir.
Yeah,
the
I
moment you-
usually, when I
Do it
see the
yourself.
end of I do it yourself because I have been doing since many years. So and once
Dr.
we
Abhi-
wait for 24 hours, then again repeat if it is not improving. But I don't wait according to as Dr. Anita said rightly, yes, studies show that count finger hand movement is there, immediately go for vitrectomy.
Dr. Abhijit, a fast comment from you about the moment one sees a case of suspect a case of endophthalmitis, how to go about? Very fast. First instance when you see that. Dr. Abhijit.
Yeah, tell me, what is the question?
Question
First
is that the
instance
moment,
is
on the first instance when somebody suspects an endophthalmitis, how to go about? What shall he or she do when sees a
Oh.
case of endophthalmitis?
We
The first
start
thing.
the different drops, we counsel the patient first. I think the very first thing, we counsel the patient and the relatives about the poor prognosis. And then if it is referred, then we have to tell them nicely about that the other surgery was done okay and the complication may happen, and this way, because there will be a very big risk of medical complication and you have to be a witness against your fellow surgeon maybe. So that is the very first thing. Next, you start on topical drops and you take the patient to the OT for the TAP, AC vitreous, and give the intravitreal antibiotics also. And yeah, tell me. And
The preferred topical antibiotics?
topical, we give in the first instance Vancomycin.
No, the topical. Vancomycin topical.
Yes. Yeah, fortified vancomycin, fortified ceftazidime, and moxifloxacin eye drops.
Moxifloxacin. Any oral medications do you prefer?
Oral medication, we use moxifloxacin or ciprofloxacin routinely.
Oral moxifloxacin,
Yeah.
OD or BD loading dose and then OD.
Yeah, BD loading dose, then OD, or maybe 750 milligrams ciprofloxacin twice daily, or 10 days at least.
Okay. I think our times is up, and it was very nice interacting with everyone and
thank
seeing you all hale and hearty. Thank you
Yeah,
very much.
in fact, that was quite nice to see everybody around here.
We are the old team united again.
Yes.
Yes.
But next time we'll
Thank you
unite
so
with
much,
some other
sir.
topic maybe.
Definitely.
Garima, it was very nice of you.
Very
Thank you
cool
so much
presentation
for
by
giving
Dr.
us
Garima.
Yes.
Thanks for giving us the opportunity, Rajesh sir.
Yes, but you know what we are missing? You know it very well. Okay.
Hope to meet
Bye-bye.
sometime. Okay.
Bye.
Thank you
Bye,
so much
everyone.
for
Bye,
giving
all.
us the
Very
time. I
nice.
appreciate all
Bye.
speakers. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Thank you, Sanjay. It was nice.
Thank
It
you,
was
Sanjay.
seamless.
Thank you,
Thank
Dr.
you.
Sanjay. Fantastic.
Take care. Thank you.
Thanks all. Bye.